this computer. There we go. Right. Okay. So we are recording. So if you want to watch back any of this, just as a reminder, you can. But there's a few people that are on interview today that I know can't make it. And there's been a few apologies for other reasons, but I'm a little bit concerned by the best 60 people being here, but I'm just wondering where the other 40 less amazing people are. But there we are. You guys are here, that's what matters, right? So there we go. I've made this statement. It was recorded. All of you people that didn't turn up on time, unless you've given us good excuses, you can hang your head in shame. What I wanted to try to do was get you started on the process of thinking about how am I going to best set myself up to illustrate having met the standards to as high a possible standard as I can by the time my next progress tutorial comes. So we will have another preparing for your final progress tutorial session, but I want this process to start now, early on this half term, rather than leave it until the end. And then you've got to kind of like do it retrospectively, when actually it doesn't make a lot of sense to do so. You will develop more effectively if you are proactive and you start this process right now. Right, okay, so raising standards. How do we get you from achieving a standard to a good level of progress, or from a good level of progress to a higher level of progress? We're not going to go into masses of depth on this because I think the principles are the same for all of the standards. It just requires you to engage with what's written down and actually try to understand it in the context of what you're doing in school, the conversations that you're having with your school-based mentor, the experiences that you're having in terms of planning, teaching, assessing, evaluating your lessons, etc., etc. So first part of the presentation is to look at some of the phrases that we read in the substandards associated with the teacher standards. So I want you to look at the next two phrases. There's one which is I think it's achieving and good. And I want you just to kind of just for a moment compare the two. So how does one compare with the other? What are the differences? And how might you be able to fit more closely with the good one rather than just the achieving one? Okay, so I was meant to flipping animate this and I didn't, did I? Sorry, I've been a bit distracted today. Anyway, ignore my statements there. I should just change it right now, but I've given you the answers there. But look at the statements. There is one where I've definitely left them off because I was going to give that to you to do without my support at all. So you've got two statements. They're about teaching standard 2, and the substandard is this one: to be aware of a pupil's capabilities and their prior knowledge and plan teaching to build on these. Now I've focused on achieving and good, okay, because I know that's where many of you are. Some of you are already on good and you'll be looking at going to high, but we'll talk about that one next. But many of you might be on achieving for that one at the moment and be looking to try to get it good. So look at the difference in the statement. Seeing as I've given you the answers, I'll just read it and you can enjoy dulcet tones. So if you're achieving that standard, you have shown that you are aware of pupils' capabilities and their prior knowledge, and you've planned to teach them to build on those. Okay, so there is evidence that you've done that or can do that. The suggestion here is that you've got that level of awareness and you've acted on it, but it's not necessarily something that you've really fully integrated into your regular and routine practice yet. So there's a minimum expectation here for achieving. And remember, all of the standards and substandards have to be at achieving as a minimum by the end of your time with us and your time with your placement school. So as it says here, the minimum expectation is that you'll have an awareness of the class's characteristics and their stage of learning. Now that might simply mean that you know that they're in year 7, you know what the curriculum content is for that particular topic, for that particular age and stage of those pupils, and therefore you also know what they will have learned beforehand, because you've got that curriculum detail, you've got the scheme of work, you've got access to an exam board specification perhaps, so you know what it is that they will come with, ready to start teaching them the next bit of that curriculum. So that should be recognized and reflected in your plan. Okay, so it makes sense. There will be some evidence of that. You'll also have, sorry, I'm going to mute everybody. I think that might be you. So I'm just going to mute you, hopefully. There we go, right. Yeah, so you've got some awareness of the pupils set, their overview of the prior attainment as well. So it's an overview. It's nothing in detail at this stage, but you're using that to plan your teaching, to build on that. It doesn't even say plan your teaching effectively, but it just shows that you've got the intent there. Now, I would very much doubt that any of you haven't already achieved that standard. You should all be doing that already. So if you're not yet on achieving, that's when you really need to start asking a few questions and thinking to yourself about what I've just told you, and think, right, I've got to make it absolutely clear to my mentor that this is something that I'm aware of. I know what the curriculum is. I know what their prior knowledge is that they've covered. I know what their current scores are and their expected scores are, and I'm planning on using that. In order to achieve that to a good level, then look at the difference. It talks about, uses the word good, so it has a good understanding now. So it's not just an awareness of the pupil's capabilities, it's got a good understanding of. And I think the difference between the two is, one, you've got a list of data and you're aware of it. You know that most of the kids are on a target grade of maybe a level 6 or something, and there's a few that are on different level scores, but you've got that rough overview. To have a good understanding, you will have analysed that in more detail. You'll have literally looked down that list and you'll have thought, right, I know these pupils by name, and I'm looking carefully for the differences in their scores from the previous assessment to what they've recently been assessed at in a homework or in an end of unit test or something. So it says that you also assess pupils' achievement, and then you plan and teach lessons that enable them to make at least expected progress. And it does also say, including those that are disabled or have special educational needs. So I'm just going to say you're doing that for everybody, okay, irrespective of their background and their needs, but they're making at least expected progress. So in order to be able to achieve that standard, you have to know what their expected progress is. So what are we expecting them to get? What are they getting? And in order to achieve it to a good level, that knowledge will allow you to be planning lessons that overall is enabling those kids to make the progress to get them to the standard that is expected of them. You cannot do that if you've not looked at their prior assessment data. You cannot do that if you've not got knowledge of their target grade or their minimum expected grade or their benchmark grade or their target grade or whatever it is that the school calls it. So it's really, really important to find that information out. Excuse the little typo there where it says 7, it's meant to say and. I think I must have just not pressed shift at the right time in my haste. So if you think about how we've moved from achieving to good, what we've basically got to do in order to provide evidence of that is actually gather that existing data and update it with your information. So what information are you gathering from the homework scores and from the tests that you're doing and the little mini assessments or plenaries that you're doing? And then you're making use of that to make sure that your lessons are planned to that level, and that the pupils through that process are able to actually make good progress and meet their expected benchmark grades. So it means that your teaching is being effective. So if we think about how that then moves on one step further and goes on to getting to a high level of achievement, well, think about the difference here. Now, the difference is far more subtle. Okay, so this one said has a good understanding of pupils' capabilities, whereas this one says has a detailed understanding. Now, what we mean by that is to some extent a little bit open to interpretation, but I think you've got to be thoughtful about how you ask the question of your mentor. What do they think that means? To make sure that you've got a shared understanding. I'll tell you what I think it means, but you need to have the conversation with your subject mentor so that when they're assessing you and thinking about, well, which standard do I think you as a student has met, you've got that shared understanding. If you're just leaving it to them to make a decision and you haven't had a conversation about what we mean by detailed understanding compared to a good understanding, then you're just a hostage to their interpretation. It's good to have these conversations. This is why you should have a weekly mentor meeting where you're not just talking about the last lesson that they observed, you're talking about the evidence that you're gathering overall, your progress towards these outcomes and standards, so that you're developing that shared understanding. So my interpretation of what a detailed understanding is that it's not just about test data. That's the simple, basic expectation. You should be assessing kids and gathering evidence of their progress in a summative form, quantitative form. But I think a detailed understanding goes one step beyond that. So in order to reach a high level of achievement, I think you've got to do that, the idea of live marking, where you're not just assessing periodically their progress, you're actually assessing more consistently, more routinely, more regularly their progress in terms of their understanding. So through asking verbal questions, but making a note of the fact that they're responding accurately. But it might also be that empirical data from your observation about the level of effort they're making, how confident they are when they're speaking. Are they using the correct kind of subject terminology that you would expect a pupil that's really excelling in this subject to be using? Or are they improving their use of subject terminology in line with where you're expecting them to progress? So that's one of the sort of significant differences. The next one, let's have a look, demonstrates through their planning and teaching that their pupils, including those with special needs and disabilities, make good progress. So rather than just meeting the expected standard for that particular pupil, they're now making good progress. So it's like meeting their aspirational grade. So in some schools, they'll have a benchmark grade, which is essentially the minimum expected grade, what we're kind of hoping they're going to achieve. And then sometimes they'll have a target grade, which is like a slightly higher grade, maybe the aspirational grade, it's sometimes called. And in order to make a high level of achievement against this particular standard, that's the kind of thing we want to see. Now, it doesn't say all the time, but it does imply much of it happens. So it says much of the quality of teachers, training teachers over time is of high quality and never less than routinely good. So the suggestion is here that it doesn't need to happen for every single pupil in every single lesson that you teach, but overall, it should be that most pupils are in this category. So all of them should be at least on target, and for most or many of those pupils, we should be seeing them exceeding their expected or their benchmark grades. So you need to engage with these descriptors in order to know where to go next. And I would really recommend that you go back to your previous report and have a look at which boxes have been clicked on by your mentor and think to yourself, okay, I'm achieving this one, I'm good on this one. How do I demonstrate to my mentor that I'm going from achieving to good? What is it that I think I need to do? Let's check that with my mentor. If I do this, this, and this, is that likely to be sufficient evidence for you as my mentor to be able to say that I've met that to a good level? Okay, I really want to encourage you to be proactive about this. Have those conversations. Make sure the mentor's engaging with the standards and they've got the same kind of interpretation of the terminology that you have as well, and that you've agreed that if you do X, Y, and Z, it gives them the confidence, the evidence to actually say, yes, I think you've met that to a good level now, or you've met that to a high level. So that was for teaching standard 2. I've got another example here for teaching standard 6. So very similar in many ways, but obviously it's a completely different standard. This one is talking more about feedback in this particular substandard rather than a knowledge of the pupils and assessment, although assessment clearly ties in with feedback. So this is talking about, this is one that I felt quite a few people in my progress group perhaps hadn't achieved to as good a level as some of the other standards. So this is talking about the quality of the feedback that you're giving. So even to be achieving this, you're giving regular feedback, both orally and through accurate marking, and encourages pupils to respond to that feedback. So you must ensure that in your plans and in your actions in the lessons, you are actually doing that. You're assessing them, you're giving them feedback, as it says, orally and verbally, and then you're giving them an opportunity to respond to that. And that can be quite simple to be achieving it. It doesn't have to be, intense, but you're giving them responses to the work that you're marking, and you're asking them to respond to that feedback in some way. It doesn't give you much steer here. It just means that you're asking them to read it and respond to it. And it could be literally that simple. Over on this side, to achieve it to a good level, you're actually being a little bit more specific, and you're using particular strategies to support that feedback being more effective. You're giving them that opportunity. So you're building time into a lesson, perhaps to have a bit of an opportunity to reflect on the feedback from their homework or from the previous lessons assessment that you've undertaken, or the test that they've just done. You're giving them the opportunity in the lesson to actually reflect on the feedback and do something with it. So a range of methods might mean that you're giving them, for some people, it might be repeated questions of a similar nature because they got it wrong and they just need to practice a method. So in mathematics, there's a really, that's the obvious example. You failed to do this one correctly. Here's 5 more. Now I've shown you how to do that one correctly. Can you do these 5 of a similar nature? If they've done really well, it's not kind of good enough to be good at this, to just say you've done really well, well done. You've then got to think, well, okay, they've done this really well. How could I extend that a little bit further and get them to sort of develop further? So that would be the case where you might say, you've answered these questions brilliantly. How might this idea translate to this context? So you might be giving them an opportunity then to apply a skill or some knowledge to an unfamiliar context. That's quite often what an exam paper will do in order to differentiate pupils that are kind of average grade to those that have exceeded above the average grade in a subject. The idea of being able to apply existing understanding but to a new context, that's quite an important thing to be able to do. So showing that you do that will enable you to go from achieving and just simply saying, well done, reflect on my feedback, and the feedback just says, you know, you got this one wrong, correct it, to, right, you've got this one wrong, I think you'll be supported by doing a few more examples of this. I think the other thing that was worth mentioning here is that it talks about regular assessment or marking, which is assessment, and it's accurate. Well, clearly you'd hope that all assessment that you're doing is accurate. So providing that's the case, then you can kind of tick that one off quite easily. But the idea that it's regular is something that you can only really illustrate once you've been doing it for a period of maybe 4 or 5 weeks. So at the end of this term, this half-term period, on the run up to the May half-term holiday, hopefully you've had sufficient numbers of lessons where you can actually say, my marking and assessment of pupils' work is regular. It doesn't mean you've got to do it every night. It just means that there's got to be a pattern and a purposeful pattern of marking and assessment. And your department and your school will have an agreed frequency of marking, but you've got to buy into that in order to really illustrate that you've made a good level of progress against that particular substandard. Then, this was what I was going to ask you to do, so I might just stop talking and get you to read that. What evidence would enable your mentor to suggest that you've actually met that same standard, but to a high level? Look at the differences between the statements. I'm going to shut up for a few moments and ask you to think about what the difference might be. So it's the standard that we've just been talking about, but we're looking at going from good to high now. So what are the key differences, and what might the evidence look like to show that you are meeting it to a high level? The differences are really subtle, aren't they? It's not, you know, in terms of what you're actually doing, it's not much difference really. Anyone want to shout out, or shall I pick somebody at random? Don't forget to enable your microphone. Looks like I'm going to have to do a random selection. Actually, tell you what, Fiona, save me kind of coming off my screen. Would you do that for me? Choose somebody at random.
I'll go. It has to be constructive, so like something really practical that they can actually physically do, rather than saying, oh, okay, yeah, that's good, or that's not so good. It has to be something constructive, like something practical they can put in place.
Right, great. So there's got to be some, that would suggest there's going to be some literal outcome, some sort of tangible outcome, something new that they've applied that process to, some new kind of response, a new answer to a new question or something. Yeah. Yeah, nice idea, Carly. Anything else, anybody, or Carly, if you want to add anything to what you've said?
Routinely as well, so maybe doing it in every lesson, making sure there's some kind of feedback for everyone.
Yeah, and this is where there's some tension here, because you're told to do so many things routinely, aren't you? You're having to do a recap and retrieval of stuff that they've done previously, but there's no reason why these things can't actually tick off two boxes in a sense. Yes, you've got to do, for many of you, you're being told at the start of every lesson there's got to be some kind of recall activity. Well, there's no reason why that couldn't be associated with some assessment that you've undertaken, which has informed you about their level of understanding. And the next sort of activity is the thing that illustrates that routine use of effective methods of giving them some feedback, because the feedback doesn't always have to be personal and individual. It can be, this number of people or this group of people, I want you to think about this. You guys did pretty well, so I just want you to repeat something or apply it. You guys really struggled, so I'm going to get you to look at this. It can tap into the recall and retrieval and sort of interleaved understanding that you're also trying to develop, but it's a deliberate routine and a sort of characteristic of your lessons. Thanks, Carly. I think the only other thing that springs out there is the timely thing. So, when we say something is timely, it's not just quick, it's happening to make a difference at the right stage. So if you've given them an assessed piece of work and you've not marked it for 4 weeks and you've moved on to the next topic, that's clearly not timely. If you've done, a bit of a sort of a vocab test, because you know that next lesson you want to apply the vocabulary in an extended piece of writing, then it would make sense that the vocab test and the spelling or whatever you're trying to evaluate there, the assessment is done in a timely fashion. Again, it doesn't mean you have to do that necessarily. You could have planned to do that as self-assessment or peer assessment, but it's a timely manner that allows them to then put that into action in a meaningful way, taking things forward. It's about moving your pupils onward. Any thoughts or questions about the suggestions that we've made here?
There is a question. Well, there are a couple of questions in the chat, one of which I think we'll address when we talk about the evidence collection for the tutorial. But Katie's raised a good point that obviously in some schools they're not allowing them to take in students' books to mark, and therefore obviously it's difficult to kind of collect that evidence as they're going through. Simply at their school they're doing a diagnostic test at the beginning and end of a unit, and then there's formative assessment happening during the progress of the lesson. And Katie's asking, is that sufficient? But I think it still comes back to what you were saying about whatever information you're collecting through whatever assessment methods that you are using. How is that informing you? How is it then allowing you to give really pertinent feedback to that student at that particular time? And then, kind of where is the impact of the next steps in their learning coming from what you're doing there? So I don't think it matters, does it, John, that if they don't have the class books, they're still learning things about their pupils, what they're understanding, where they're at, and they should be using that information to inform what interventions they offer, what feedback they give, and what the next steps in learning and planning are going to be.
Yeah, so it's as Fiona says, it's your response in the moment at times which illustrates accurate and timely marking. I mean, marking isn't necessarily the formal written work, it is that observation of how they're applying their learning in the moment. So I saw a really nice lesson this week in maths where, just through listening to what the pupils were saying, it became clear that a few of them had a misunderstanding about something. And then acting upon that in a timely way meant that the whole class ended up knowing what they should be doing. And that, I would suggest, was accurate and timely marking and assessment and feedback. But it wasn't written down. And in fact, it may not have even been mentioned in the sort of final page of the formal lesson observation. But that's an example where there is evidence of your good practice and your constructive feedback and assessment of pupils in the moment. So don't worry about the fact that not everything is this sort of tangible written evidence, but there are other ways that you can get around that too. I mean, just to think outside the box a bit, Katie, maybe, you know, Plickers is a really great tool, and I'm not suggesting you go and do this, but I know that some people are. So even though you're not able to collect the books in, if you use something like Plickers, where you've got the barcode and you can ask multiple choice questions and the kids respond, you can actually harvest that data without collecting the books in. So there are sometimes ways around not being able to do some of the things, and rather than just thinking I can't do it, therefore I'll abandon it, you can sometimes think around the issue and think about other ways of doing it. But I don't want you to kind of just do that and it take you ages, and it's a real sort of drain on you and your other commitments and the other things you're trying to develop. But you know, if it's something that you could do quite easily, then it might actually help plug that gap if you feel that there is one there. So don't be afraid to be creative. And I think the other thing I'd remind you of here is talk to your subject mentor and just say, look, we're not collecting books in at the moment, so it's going to be a bit hard to do this, this, and this. So what do you think I could do in the lesson that will help illustrate that I've met that standard to a higher level than I currently am? And see what they suggest. They might say, well, you know, given that we're not taking the books in, I can't count that against you. But what I would want to see you do is a little bit more of the use of, I don't know, mini whiteboards to kind of like do that immediate assessment of pupil understanding and application of the skills you've been teaching them, and see you responding to that in a way that illustrates you're really taking account of what they're showing you. You're not just doing it for the sake of doing it, you're making use of that assessment in order to give them appropriate feedback. Any other questions popped up in the chat, Fiona?
No, there are none, John.
Okay, so moving on to thinking about evidence, what I wanted to do here, and for many of you, you'll just sit there hopefully thinking, you know what, I did a pretty good job of that. I've done exactly what John's showing me here. But I've taken a few examples of a couple of people's progress tutorial work. And what you see is just the images on the PowerPoint slides that supported the storytelling, the narrative. And to be quite honest, in a way, the most important bit was the narrative. However, it is really, really valuable that the narrative is supported by, where possible, some tangible evidence, because it helps kind of contextualize what we as progress tutors are looking at and thinking about and what you're telling us. But it also helps keep you on track. It reminds you of the things you want to say. And I think that comes across, I think, in these examples here. Now, apologies if it gives it away who it was. I think I've checked through and I've hidden names to pretty much. There's a couple of initials there that you could possibly use to work it out. But these are good examples. So nobody should feel too bad about me sharing them, I hope. The things that I thought were interesting here, and I'm going to ask Fiona to talk about these, because these were actually ones that Fiona engaged with, but I thought it was really interesting here to see that the student teacher had actually copied the targets from the lesson observations that were undertaken, those 4 formally observed lessons. They deliberately went and copied the target and the relevant positive statement from that final page that associated with that particular standard. But I thought it was quite interesting how they were drawing on the targets that had been raised and then actually talking about the things that they'd done to address those targets. So it wasn't just I was given targets every week. Well, we know that. What we want to know is that you're actually responding to them, you're doing something about it, and there's the evidence to illustrate how I use that target to get better at what I was trying to do. That's the important bit. And that's why I want you to start doing this now. So this week, given that most of you have had a week now, some of you have had 2 weeks, you should be in a position where you could say, right, that was my formally observed lesson for this week. Let's look at my targets. Let's think about something I'm going to do next week to really illustrate that I've taken that on board. I've done something about it. I've tried it out in the next lesson, and fingers crossed, it was helpful, it was successful, or at least there's some evidence of my progress towards my end goal. Key points are brought to the fore. So obviously highlighting specific components of what they felt demonstrated high expectations, inspiring, motivating, and challenging pupils. And I felt that those points were being made as kind of reminders, really, just little markers to say, look, this is something I need to talk to my progress tutor about. what else was worth mentioning? Right, I'm going to move on to the next slide, and then I'm going to let Fiona kind of come back to those, because obviously you might have something to add to that, Fiona. So the other thing with this was that there were 2 slides for each of these standards. Now, I'm not saying there needs to be. Some people did a really effective job with just 1 slide per standard. I would suggest that, you know, any more than 2 is beginning to kind of get a bit too much. You know, you've got to limit what you present so that you can talk about it in more detail. It's not just about quantity, it's more about the quality of conversation. But what I really liked here was that the things that were being raised on that previous slide and highlighted as evidence of good practice were really coming across in the examples of the teachers' presentation. So this is an example of what they were presenting to the pupils. There was a bit of information grabbed from one of the lesson plans to illustrate the specific questioning and who that was going to be targeted at. The idea of raising expectations and having high expectations for kids that are appropriate to their particular circumstances. We've got some really nice examples of pupil work to show the kind of quality of presentation as well as quantity and the quality of writing that we can see here. And what else? Let's think, what did I say up there? Hang on. Yeah, so again, I just felt that the actual demonstration of the feedback and then this idea of giving them an opportunity perhaps to think about what it would have been better if. The only thing that you could have done possibly that was a little bit, that extends that on further, relates back to that standard that we were just talking about, where maybe the next opportunity you have of being with this class, you might have shown what they actually did with that feedback. So in a future lesson, can you show that they've actually taken on board the advice you've given? Right, so Fiona, that was me kind of like stealing your show a little bit.
That's okay. I will add just a couple of things though, John. I mean, obviously you said that the slides support the narrative, and that for me is a really important sort of determiner as to how much you're actually making sense of the progress that you're making. Because this could have been a presentation where simply, you know, this person talks about the targets that have been set for them, and I did this, and then I did this, and then I did this. And it could have become a bit of a list of, I was just told to do these things and therefore I am doing them, and here they are. But actually through the narrative, there was a real discussion of, you know, this is what I was suggested I should be considering. This was my response, and this is the strategy that I thought would work perhaps most effectively for this group of learners or that particular students. And this is my kind of reflection on what I would sort of do next time, or what was successful about this particular approach, which I took into the next lesson, or what then again I tweaked or thought I need to tweak going forward again. So it was a constant sense of this being to use that really kind of hackneyed metaphor, a journey. This is where I was at. This is what my starting point was. These are the things I did along the way, and I'm still moving forward with this by doing X, Y, and Z. So there was a kind of a much more kind of critical discussion about the efficacy of the choices that were being made, not just I've done this because I've been told that I should. And I also felt that, and this was something that I've discussed with a number of my sort of tutees, that for the May half-term tutorial, particularly for things like motivating pupils or showing progress over time, you could really focus in on not just simply kind of a 4-lesson bundle, but looking at a pupil's work at the start of the term, and then where are you after 4 or 5 or 6 weeks of teaching, and start to sort of tell that joined up story about their development because of what you are doing as a teacher. So John, that was all I was going to add.
Yeah, great. I think the only other thing that I would add is that I don't know whether you did this, Fiona, but I certainly know that when I was talking to people in my progress group, very often these standards overlap a lot, don't they? You know, there's evidence within a statement on a lesson observation or in the student's own evaluation of what they've done that actually taps into other standards too. So if you look at the information here, it talks about differentiation. It talks about recapping prior knowledge. So with differentiation, we're tapping into teaching standard 5 with that idea of recapping on prior knowledge. That probably taps into effective teaching and learning, which is teaching standard 4. A pyramid of varying difficulty questions. Again, that's TS4. Let's have a look what else we got here. There's something about managing behavior. So yeah, meeting and greeting basically. So as the students arrive to the lesson, there's that idea that you're sort of talking, asking them how they're feeling. So that's very much about teaching standard 7. So while I would have been listening to this, I'd probably have been making some notes in those other teaching standard boxes too, to illustrate that depth and breadth of understanding and depth and breadth of experience is not just addressing that one standard for this particular slide. It taps into those other things too. Right, I'm going to give another example really quickly, just as another simple overview, but a few different types of evidence here. This is all for TS7, because I know that some people say, well, how do I show behavior management? Because you've got to be there to see it. But actually there are quite a few nice examples here of the things that can be done. So statements within the formal lesson observation can quite often corroborate the effectiveness of your teacher behaviors on the pupils' behaviors. So you can see on the final page, brilliant behavior management, great warmth, personality with students. That's a really reassuring comment for you to get. And it's also a reassuring comment for us to hear, because clearly whoever's watched the lessons felt that's had an impact, a positive impact on the outcomes. Equally, it was interesting to know that there was a challenge there. This student teacher recognized that actually that I do have a really difficult class, and that there was a discussion that took place between the mentor and the student, and there was a decision to make some positive phone calls home. Let's have a look, what else have we got? So an email which says confirmation that the student teacher had attended some CPD on behavior management. So that's another thing that illustrates a commitment to improving your professional practice. Again, I think there were just 2 slides. So there was that one and there was this one from the same student, but it shows a range of different types of evidence. So we've got that final page of the lesson observation. There's the actual content of one lesson observation. There was an email from a colleague in school who'd given that CPD session. And then there's this idea about, I knew I had to do something in order to address a problem, and this is what I tried out. So we had this idea of a silent starter, because the beginnings of lessons were perhaps a little bit disjointed, a bit unruly, and the student teacher here thought, I know, I'm going to try this out. And there's a really good example of an approach to managing behavior that's really proactive. It's expecting good behaviors. It's not just responding to bad behaviors. It's trying to set the scene and set the stage more clearly at the start of the next lesson. So it's a really good example of how they've responded to a problem that they recognized existed, and the outcome was, and I think this lesson observation feedback highlights that it was a calm classroom, clear expectations of students. So therefore the suggestion was that this silent starter activity did set the stage a little bit clearer, and the outcome was really positive. So hopefully a lot of you are thinking, that's exactly the kind of thing I was doing, and great, keep it going, because that's what we want to see. But I definitely know, and I'm not going to name and shame, but there's definitely a few people, well, there was a third one for this slide anyway. There's definitely a few of you out there whose breadth and range of evidence was far more limited than that. And the narrative was not as supported by the things that you were bringing to the table. So the conversation wasn't as in-depth. It didn't illustrate your understanding of the standards as effectively. It probably didn't illustrate the great stuff you're doing in the classroom. And that's all we're asking you to do. Okay, we're not trying to trip you up here. We're giving you an opportunity to show us what you're actually achieving in the classroom. So final remarks before we finish the session. Remember, it's about a strong narrative. You can only develop that if you start thinking about it soon enough. If you get to the end of this half term before you start thinking about what story you're going to tell me, Andy, Fiona, or Roger, you're going to be making it up, and it's not going to be as compelling. So start now and develop the narrative organically. It'll come naturally to you then. The evidence coming from a range of sources really helps. So don't just rely on that back page of the formal lesson observation. Try and pull on different things, your own evaluations, SWOT analysis. What did you think? What did the teacher observing it think? Where's the evidence from the pupil work? Where's some assessment data perhaps that supports something that you're trying to say? Where's an example of a differentiated approach to your teaching to cater for different pupils? Make links between that evidence and the narrative. Don't assume that we're going to be able to join the dots. Have the narrative and the evidence support each other. So it should be a very much a linked tale. It's like a picture book, I suppose. And like I say, start it now. Don't leave it until the end. It should be iterative. It should start now and actually impact next week and the week after and the week after. And then the last thing to say is, don't forget to present this evidence to your subject mentor, because I've also seen a mentor and had a good conversation with them in a school where the student teacher was doing really well, but the mentor hadn't felt able to make as positive comments on the end of term report, simply because the only lessons they'd seen were the ones of their classes, and they hadn't, I want to say they hadn't bothered, it's a bit rude to say that, because they hadn't had the opportunity, I think it's probably a better way to say it, to talk to their colleagues about the things that the trainee teacher had been doing with their colleagues' classes, and the student teacher hadn't brought to the table that same range of evidence that you're hoping to present to your progress tutor. So the evidence that the subject mentor was basing the report on was limited. So take it to them, show them what you're doing. If you're teaching classes that aren't theirs, make sure they know about the quality of resources, the quality of teaching. Don't just rely on the mentor meeting as an opportunity to debrief the lesson of theirs that they watched. The mentor meeting should be about you talking about your progress towards the standards, the evidence that you've got, the evidence that they're expecting, so that when they write your final report, they're going to have bags of evidence, bags of confidence that you're doing all of the things that you're intending to do really effectively.
John, can I then just tie that to the question that was asked in the chat earlier?
Yeah.
Because obviously you talked about marking pupils' work and using that regular marking as part of one of the standards. And Helen's asked, do we need to evidence regular marking in our tutorials as part of this 4-lesson bundle? For me, I think I don't want to see slides and slides of you slaving away at midnight marking books and 30 examples of your marking. But for me, it comes back to the story that you're telling. You're doing this regular marking. What are you learning from it? And then how is that then informing the planning that you're doing for your next lessons, the interventions or the scaffolding that you're providing for students going forward? Would you agree with that or add anything differently?
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I think, the regularity of marking is different in different subject areas. And I certainly know there's a difficult balance there between spending time planning, spending time marking, making sure your marking's timely and effective, but also that you're not killing yourself in the process. However, if you are marking reasonably regularly, there should be some evidence of that, maybe in your own mark book, where you've kept a record of the scores. If you're marking work, don't just mark it and give it back to them. Keep the evidence of it somehow and make use of the evidence somehow. Otherwise, what's the point of marking? If you're just marking to give them feedback and then you're not giving them an opportunity to act on it, that's not very helpful. If you're marking, you're not keeping a record of the scores, you're not informing your overall understanding of how they're progressing. So please make sure that you're keeping a record of it. So no, we don't need to see examples of, marking over X number of weeks, other than the fact that there might be evidence of it within your mark, your mark book, as it were, your records of marking, and also within your planning, that evidence that you're actually moving things forward based upon the marking that you're doing.
That's all of the questions in the chat. Just call back day, just to make clear for everybody. So your mentors have all been informed about this, just a reminder for them this week, but it is on Friday the 7th of May. It is going to be online rather than in person, given kind of where we're at in terms of COVID restrictions. We'll send out details about the day, obviously closer to the day, but just to make sure that you're having conversations with the class teachers of lessons that you have on that Friday. There could be the expectation that you set cover work for the classes. So be proactive about that, be professional about that, tell them you won't be in on that day. Do they want you to set work for them? They might be really lovely and say, no, it's fine, we'll do it for that day. And you can buy them a drink later on to say thank you for that. But I think it's good practice to get into the habit of asking those questions, of setting cover work, because that's what you would have to do as a teacher in role if you were going to miss any class. That's everything.
Okay, and I'm guessing that there will be somebody who says, I've got an interview on callback day. Well, we'll make sure that we share any specific outcomes, and if there are any parts of the session that are worth recording and sharing, then we'll record those. So yeah, obviously, we expect the vast majority of you to be there, unless you have an interview, essentially. Okay, so we'll be around for a few minutes if anyone wants to stick around, ask any personal questions. Otherwise, take care, guys. I hope everything's going well. It's nice to see you. I look forward to seeing some more of you later this half term for lesson observations, as I'm sure your subject leads will as well. Adios, ciao, arrivederci.